Hey everybody, it's Mrs. McGurkin. I wanted to give you guys some notes on genetics to get started on the next unit. So what you're going to be looking at today is some just introductory vocab. Some of it may be review from 7th grade or so, but some may be new. So use your handout that you guys got in the back to fill in this paper. Um, you're also going to be putting this into your notebook when you finish up, so please make sure that it ends up in there in a safe spot. So when we talk about genetics, it's basically broken down into two different parts. We can have what's called molecular genetics, and that's what we've been talking about with like gene editing and all of those A's, T's, C's, and G's with DNA. But you can also have Mendelian genetics, and that's what this is that we're going to be talking about. So it takes the genes that you guys see here for, in this case, a tall pea plant, and crossing it with a gene for short pea plants. So if you notice in this case, you have two letters here, and the two letters represent the two genes. One would come from mom and one would come from dad. So those different forms of genes that you have are called alleles. So those are represented by letters when we talk about Mendelian genetics. So sometimes if you notice, you have T's that are capitalized and T's that are lowercase. Those represent two types of traits, and that is called a dominant trait. In this case, being tall is a dominant trait. You could also have a recessive trait. So when you have a dominant allele present, you're always going to show that dominant trait. So if you look over here, you have a recessive allele too, but the dominant kind of overshadows it. Okay, so you only need one dominant allele in order for that trait to get passed on. So if you notice, you can get tall plants with this and with these genotypes. Recessive, you absolutely have to have two of the recessive traits together in order for the recessive trait to appear. So if you've been doing research for your heredity project, you've probably heard that some of your heredity disorders are recessive, and that's because you would get two alleles that are recessive from one from mom and one from dad in order to have that recessive trait, okay? So these two letters together are known as what are called genotypes, and that's your genetic makeup. In this case, there are different ways that you can represent that. So TT would be what we would call pure dominant because it's the same capital letters. You could have big T, little t, and that's like a hybrid because you have one of each. And then you can have pure recessive, which is little t, little t. And those lowercase letters represent, again, a recessive trait. Okay, so the outcome of these letters are what we call a phenotype. Sorry, I hope you guys can see this. Phenotypes are physical characteristics. Some examples of those are like we showed over here in the picture. You can have tall plants by having big T, or big T, little t. Short plants are only going to show up when you have little t, and that's the only way because short is the recessive trait. Okay, so phenotype, physical characteristic, genotype, genetic makeup. All right, so next up, here are some examples of the reason we call this Mendelian genetics is because a guy named Gregor Mendel did some experiments with these pea plants. So these are the traits that he focused on, all right? So for our next thing, we're gonna focus on flower color in pea plants. And that'll give us another set of terms that we'll use quite often, all right? So if we were to have purple versus white flowers. All right, so first of all, we have three different ways that we can show genotype here. So we're not talking about plant height anymore. So we're going to use a different letter. So we can use capital P's to show a pure genotype. We can use a capital and a lowercase, big and little, to show a hybrid genotype, or we can use lowercase p's to show, again, a pure genotype, okay? So there are two terms that you're going to use interchangeably, or not interchangeably, often when you guys are talking about genetics. So homozygous and heterozygous. So when you have these big words in science class, remember to use your root words, okay? So being homozygous is the same. Being heterozygous means you have a different combination, all right? So let's take a look at these and think about what terms would go with what, okay? So which ones do we have the same letters or homozygous letters? Give you a second to think about it. All right, so those would be pure genotypes, okay? A heterozygous is going to be this hybrid one. So you're probably saying they're both P's, Mrs. McGurkin, what are you talking about? But I'm talking about the size of them basically, capital P or lowercase p, all right, which is which, okay? So notice that even though these would be two different flowers, you would still use the term homozygous for them. This hybrid is again heterozygous because it's two different cases, okay? So in terms of phenotype, what are these particular flowers going to look like? If you have capital B, capital P, or big P, that's going to give you a purple flower color. If you have big p, it's also going to give you a purple flower color. You get a different flower color from little p, because that's your recessive, okay? So if we think about this in terms of like one of those classic SAT questions, pure is to homozygous, like hybrid is to heterozygous. So these terms, pure and homozygous, you're going to see often in assignments. They mean the same thing, just like hybrid and heterozygous mean the same thing, okay? So trait, gene, and allele are three vocab terms that people are going to use interchangeably, and they really do mean different things. So I wanted to have them kind of side by side here so you guys could see the differences between them. So first off, a trait is a genetically determined characteristic. That's going to be eye color, hair color. There are genes that control those. So speaking of genes, this refers to a specific spot on a chromosome that describes a trait. So we have spots on our chromosomes that show us eye color. Same for hair color, okay? Alleles, though, are going to be the different forms of a particular gene. So if we are looking at eye color, alleles are going to be blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes, hazel eyes. So there are different ways that we get those particular genes, and those are alleles, okay? So trait is whatever that genetically determined characteristic is. The gene is the location on the chromosome that describes a particular trait, and then the alleles are the different versions or forms of that gene. All right, so I hope that's helpful. So finally, the last thing we're going to talk about are what are called Punnett squares. So you may have some familiarity with this. In this, we're just going to dive right into an example to hopefully help you guys understand what we're talking about here. So Punnett squares are diagrams that show the result of a cross. So in this case, we want to see what are some possibilities for options if we have two parents that are hybrid, in this case for albinism. So neither parent would be albino themselves. However, if you notice, because they're hybrid, they both have alleles for albinism. So what am I talking about here? So in this case, what we mean by this, like our dominant here that we're going to talk about, is having normal, oops, let me get that in the right spot, normal pigmentation. Our recessive is being albino, okay? So that those are the two traits we're looking at here. In this case, the mom, like I said, is going to produce two types of eggs. Some of the eggs are going to have the dominant allele. Some of the eggs are going to have the recessive allele. So what that's going to look like is we're going to have a big A here for the mom, and we're going to have a little a also for the mom, okay? So dad has the exact same genotype, all right? So dad's going to give us a big A, and dad has a possibility of giving us a little a too. So he's going to make some sperm that have the big A and some sperm that have the little a. All right. So when we put these on our Punnett square, the results that we come up here, you guys will see the term zygote, and maybe that looks familiar from what we were just talking about. But the zygotes are when the egg meets the sperm. It's a fertilized egg. So in this case, it may look familiar because we were just talking about heterozygous and homozygous. Well, those are the zygotes. That's how it all kind of comes together. So whenever these parents are going to mate, they are going to have a possibility of getting a particular outcome for their babies. Okay, so we're going to look at like what those possibilities are. So remember, the mom can produce eggs that have the dominant or the recessive. Same with the dad. He can produce sperm that have the dominant or the recessive. Okay, so we're going to look at all the possibilities here. So in this first zygote, one possibility is that he is going to have a sperm that fertilizes the egg with both, and they end up with both dominant alleles. So that particular baby would have no chance of being albino, okay? So they could also have the possibility of having a baby that produces big A, little a. So this individual is going to be a carrier. And there's two possible ways that that can happen. So the mom can give the big A, or the dad can give the big A, and the mom can give the little a, and vice versa. So there's two possibilities here for the baby being a carrier, all right? But if you notice over here, there is one possibility for that baby to be albino. So that's if this sperm fertilizes this egg. So honestly, whatever traits you come up with are dependent on whatever sperm swims faster to fertilize the egg that's available. Okay? And remember, this is happening for every single gene that you have on every chromosome in your genome. So this is amazing stuff when you think about it. We're talking about a lot of information here in your, outcomes. So when we look at our results, remember, phenotypes are what we have in terms of physical characteristics, okay? So phenotypes that you can have here, 3 out of 4 are going to have normal pigmentation. So that's this one, and this one. Going to be completely normal. But we do have a 1 in 4 chance of having a baby with albinism or being albino. Okay. Genotypes, though, we actually have 3 possibilities. So we have a 1 in 4 chance of having big A, 2 out of 4 chance of having big A, little a, or a 1 out of 4 chance of having little a. Okay, so those are the differences in terms of phenotypes and genotypes. Okay, so that was a lot of information. Remember, this is a video, so you can go back and rewatch and pause and go through it again if you need to. So hope that was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.